A very warm welcome to the virtual Espacio Bertelsmann in Madrid. On the occasion of Germany's EU Council presidency this year, we are organizing a series of virtual events, and I'm delighted that we are doing this together with two great partners, the German Embassy in Madrid and the Commission representation in Spain. My name is Katharina Gnad, and I'm from the German foundation Bertelsmann Stiftung. Under the title Juntos Relanzando Europa, the series of events is dedicated to discussing different aspects of the future of the EU, together with policymakers and think tankers across Spain, Germany, and Brussels. The first event was held in the summer on the EU's Green New Deal. Today, we will talk about NextGenerationEU, an instrument for the European recovery in the face of the corona pandemic. COVID has hit all of Europe, but not all European countries are affected to the same degree and not at the same time. This poses a challenge for the stability of European economies and ultimately to the functioning of the single market, but it is also a test for European solidarity and burden sharing among member states. At the same time, the pandemic accelerates existing processes of economic realignment between great global powers. And this also increases the need for the EU to bolster its external competitiveness and reaffirm its economic model on the global stage. In creating the instrument NextGenerationEU in July of this year, EU leaders sent a strong message of their political willingness, backed by unprecedented financial resources, to tackle the economic and social effects of corona. The EU institutions and member states are right now in the process of putting words into action, into laws, and into concrete projects. Many challenges remain, some of which we will have the chance of discussing today. With this, I welcome you again on behalf of all the partners, and I gladly hand over to Professor Federico Steinberg, Principal Investigator at the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid, who will moderate the debate. Federico, the floor is yours.
Welcome, everyone. As Katharina said, we are having this very important and relevant discussion today about NextGenerationEU, which is a radical proposal on the way we are going to be financing, recovery and the transformation of the European economy after the pandemic, preparing it to increase productivity, to increase growth potential, and to make sure we don't have increased divergences between the different member states. So for this discussion, we have 4 fantastic panelists. I'm going to introduce them briefly and then start the discussion. We have Claudia Dorfwort, State Secretary at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy of the Federal Republic of Germany. We have Professor Marcel Fratscher, President of the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin. We have Celine Gauer, Head of the Recovery and Resilience Task Force at the European Commission. And we have Carlos San Basilio here with me in Madrid, who is Secretary General of the Treasury and International Financing at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation here in Spain. So I'm going to start, because there's a lot of confusion around, how NextGenerationEU is going to work, by asking Celine, basically, if she can, walk us through the different steps, the deadlines, the timing, what can we expect when the funds can be disbursed, and also the governance issue. How is this going to be organized? And if there's any conflict regarding this idea of, conditionality or not, or how the funds are going to be disbursed to the countries, what can we expect for this?
So thank you very much for your question, and good morning to everyone. I'm very happy to have the occasion to debate virtually with you this morning. The investment facility, as you mentioned, is a very large facility of 672 billion to finance reforms and investment in the EU economy. The support can be given in the form of grants and in the form of loans. For Spain, we are talking about more than 60 billion in the form of and 80 billion in the form of loans. To access the funding, member states have to draw up plans, setting out the reforms and the investment that they would like to undertake in the next 6 years. These plans are very important because they are the one ensuring the state on their reform agenda and on the investment agenda. How will it work to access the funding? Since the 15th of October of this year, member states are submitting their draft plan already to the Commission, and we have a very debate and dialogue with them to refine the content of those plans. This phase of informal dialogue will continue until the end of December. From the 1st of January next year, member states will be able to formally notify their plans, and then the Commission will have 2 months to take a position on those plans and to make hopefully a proposal to the Council for approving those plans. Then, in turn, the Council has weeks to approve the plans. So if we are working all very well and if everything goes very well, we should see the first plans approved in the course of March. Then, within 2 months, the Commission will be able to make a prepayment of up to 10% of to the member states as pre-financing payment. After that pre-financing payment, and every 6 months, member states will have the opportunity to ask for disbursement if they have achieved the different milestones and targets that they will have themselves agreed with the Commission and with the Council to have in their plans. So realistically, asking when can we disbursement, I think May, June should be possible. Obviously, 2 important caveats that I have to make on this timeline. That is a timeline based on the Commission have made to the co-legislator, and that proposal is still being discussed between the Parliament and a second caveat is that obviously any payment can only be made if the budget for the next 7 years is agreed by the Council. If the decisions also is ratified by all 27 national parliaments. But if everyone works really intensively on this, should be the relevant time frame. Thank you.
Now let me move to quite a different question, which is the German position. And actually, I'm going to ask Claudia about this one in particular, because we've seen that in a certain way, Next Generation EU has been possible because Germany has shifted a little bit its position, particularly when we compare it to previous moments of turmoil in the European Monetary Union. So basically, could you tell us a little bit more about, the reason behind this new German attitude towards these elements for recovery?
Yes, thank you very much, Federico, and hello to everybody, and buenos días a nuestros amigos españoles. Es un gran placer para mí de participar a esta conferencia. Espero que todos estén bien. Okay, to your question, continuing in English, of course. If you're alluding, Federico, to the question of solidarity and questioning whether this is a shift in the German attitude, I can just tell you that solidarity has always been important to Germany, and I think we have always shown solidarity, but maybe in a different way, and maybe not everybody understood it in such a way. But now, of course, as we have as also others who spoke before me said, an unprecedented situation in Europe. Exceptional circumstances call for exceptional instruments, and in that respect, Germany indeed accepted an instrument like the Recovery and Resilience Facility, or the Next Generation instrument as a whole, which, however, is something which is limited not only in volume, but it's a big volume indeed, but limited in time, as Céline said, until 26. So we need to use that time, and Céline has described very well how things work. It is, and I have to underline that, not an unconditional budget support, of course, but it is something which is connected to the European semester, to the country-specific recommendations. And so in that respect, as Celine said, member countries are invited to present their roadmaps. But the Commission, of course, is going to examine whether all is in line with the European semester and the country-specific recommendations, because the intention is not just to, spend the money, but to use this instrument to also continue with structural reforms, to also try and work on becoming more resilient, becoming more competitive, becoming more innovative, and what have you. So I think altogether is something which is demonstrating the will of solidarity, but at the same time a spirit of cooperation, which is something which is also the motto of our German Council presidency, Together for Europe's Recovery. That's the title of our motto, and we as the presidency have the intention to continue working in that spirit. And in that respect, I hope, as Celine said, all the caveats she presented on the question when the money will be available. We are working hard on getting an agreement with the European Parliament on the trilogue of the MFF and including all instruments of next generation. And today the negotiations, if I may call them like this, will continue between our negotiator and European Parliament. So I hope we can deliver in time until Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now let me turn to Carlos for the specifics of how Spain is thinking about this Next Generation EU. What is the current thinking in the Spanish administration, the reforms, the elements that you want to stress on your program?
Yeah, thank you, Federico, and buenos días, and good morning, guten Tag, also from my side. Thank you very much for inviting us to this event. Well, we see Next Generation EU as a major breakthrough for the European Union. We think it is a very significant step towards joint action. We saw a very good example yesterday with a very successful first issuance of the program. And we think it's very consistent with what has been done over the last few months. Since the pandemic started, we've seen a very clear and consistent action from member states and from the institutions. For instance, on the escape clause, on the revision of the state aid legal framework, but also on the approval in a record time of the programs for by the ESM, by the Commission on SURE, guarantee package by the EIB. All this was done in a matter of weeks, not even 2 months, which is something that could have been perceived as inconceivable before this crisis. So we think that that Next Generation EU follows this trend of joint action and solidarity, as has been said by my predecessor. And within the Next Generation EU, there are different programs. One of them definitely that really makes a clear impact, a clear change is the Recovery and Resilience Facility. Here, Spain is going to put all our efforts to make sure that we deliver on the two main objectives that we see in this program, in this facility for Spain, which is on one hand, help us coping with the economic emergency. On the other side, to put the Spanish economy, in a more sustainable growth path looking forward. So it's not just short-term action, it's an action in these 2-3 years that will help us have a better economy in years to come. So here we have already presented the main priorities of the program. It was done by Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago with the plan España Puede. There are 4 basic priorities of the plan, which are green economy, digital economy, cohesion, and building the gender gap. But below that, for general principles, general objectives, you have a whole series of specific programs that have to deliver on the two main objectives, which is to put the Spanish economy on a sustainable and inclusive growth path. And here, I just want to say something very briefly, Federico. I think the combination of investment and reform is the right way to do it, because really it ensures that the impact of the plan is going to be long-term impact. For instance, if we think about one of the projects which is embedded in the whole program from Spain, for instance, is under the cohesion and the main priorities, we have one of the levers, which is a better education system. Under the better education system, we have a full revision of our vocational training programs. And here we're talking both about investment and about structural reform. So I want to convey this message that we're looking at it jointly from the point of view of how the plan can have an impact, a lasting impact in our economy. We know there is a lot of funds coming, and we want to make the best possible use of the funds for Spain for years to come.
Thank you. Yes, this is clearly essential because on the one hand, reforms are sometimes complicated because of political economic constraints, but if you have funding, that would be, much easier to move forward. And the key is to make sure that we have a lot of investment in this period in which without these funds, probably public investment would have been more constrained, and then private investment could also be constrained, and we would be less able to increase growth potential, which is what we all want. So I'm going to shift now to Marcel and go for a more macroeconomic question in a way. I would like to ask you, what are your growth prospects for the European Union, for the Eurozone? Do you think, different speeds of the recovery, or are these radical uncertainty situations that we're facing, completely blinding us? Are you more or less optimistic, pessimistic on your macroeconomic forecasts?
Good morning, and first of all, thank you for having me join this discussion. To your question, I also want to emphasize what the previous three speakers have been saying, that the Next Generation EU is a very important initiative for the transformation of the European economy. But your question, Federico, is more about the short term, and indeed, we have to be aware, and as was described before, Next Generation EU, the money will flow over probably starting next year and then the years after. So we still have this big challenge now in the short term over the next year. And most of our economies in Europe are in the middle of a second wave or the beginning of a second wave. And from economic perspective, in terms of projections, our baseline projection is still that we will see a gradual recovery next year, that we could be back to pre-crisis levels in maybe early 2022. Yet what I want to emphasize is that the risks are enormous. That a second wave might hit European economies, weaken them substantially. I see in particular the risk from corporate insolvencies and unemployment. These I see as two major risks for the euro area, for the EU economy. We have seen that global trade has been picking up now the last few months, but also that we shouldn't take for granted. We don't know how the impact on the financial system will be. So what I'm describing are different types of risks that each of them could pull the EU economy back into recession, so a contraction in subsequent quarters. So I want to emphasize that we are far from being through the most severe period of the crisis in terms of health, but also in terms of the economic impact. My big concern is that the impact is very different, very heterogeneous across EU economies. And sadly enough, what it seems to indicate now, the data for the past few weeks, is that the economies hit hardest by the first wave over the last half a year, March, April, May, are also very strongly affected now. So we might well see that the north-south divide in the European Union could widen. Fortunately, so far, many of the Central Eastern European economies have done relatively well. We don't know whether this will hold also now in the second wave. But what I want to describe is the risks are enormous. We don't really have many European instruments to deal with that. Yes, there is sure the possibility to finance the furlough schemes for employment. And there has been a very successful launch of the first round of financing for that the last few days. But my concern over the next year is that the EU economy could be hit very hard, that we will mainly have to rely on domestic national policymakers, in particular fiscal policy, to continue acting in a decisive manner, to continue doing so as they have done over the past half a year. So I think we need to be aware that we are far from through this crisis. And maybe a very quick final point, we should be aware that what's happening now in terms of unemployment, in terms of corporate insolvencies, could have long-term, permanent negative impact on the EU economy. And we really need to, our policymakers need to act to minimize that permanent damage so that a smooth and hopefully quick recovery can be ensured.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Yes, absolutely. And the good news, if you want, is this, the ECB has reacted very fast in being a backstop for the need to continue issuing domestic sovereign debt. But on the other hand, besides what you mentioned, we have another risk, which is Brexit. We have another risk, which is what's going to come out of the American elections and the trade relationships between the European Union and the US. So yes, on top of all the complications, we have a new risk that we have to take into account. Let me go back to Celine, to the specifics of the recovery plan. And I would like to ask you directly about the climate-related spending and programs. 37% of all the expenditure under the Recovery and Resilience Facility must be climate-related. And the idea is to foster the green transition. So in which areas do you expect the expenditure to happen, and how would you, want to keep track of that target?
Thank you very Thank you. Yes, indeed. The Green Deal was for us the growth engine and the growth agenda of the EU before the crisis hit us, and we see that this is still the case today. And we also see that the of action against climate global warming is still and has not really decreased from with the crisis. So the target of 37% has been introduced in the plan by Council that agreed on it already in July, and we see this as a huge opportunity to ensure that the facility will be used to fill the significant investment gap that we have to meet our 2050 targets. Obviously not to go back to where we were before the crisis, but to try and use this crisis as an opportunity to accelerate the green and the digital, but here more particularly the green transition of our economy. In the recent communication that we have published on the annual sustainable growth strategy, the Commission has defined a number of flagship areas where we see that investments are particularly necessary. And 3 of those 7 flagships relate to the green target. The first one is renovation of building. And we see the renovation of building as a huge potential for decreasing our CO2 emissions. As you know, they are responsible for a very, very large share of the emissions. But they are also an opportunity to boost the economy, because they are the works that are necessary to renovate the buildings are very work intensive or very labor intensive. And normally the type of companies that provide those works are local SMEs providing really jobs to a lot of our workers. So we really see with this renovation of buildings in a flagship an opportunity to combat and the need for recovery. Then the second area where we see a lot of need for investment is sustainable mobility. This is necessary not only as a source of emission, but also to improve the quality of air, in particular in our cities, and to protect the environment. And this is another area where a lot of investment have to be made, a lot of investment cross-border, and a lot of investment in the cities and in the regions as well. And then finally, clean technologies and renewables. So we know that our energy mix have to change very significantly to become carbon neutral in 2050, and the production of electricity is one of the clear of the obvious areas where investment have to go. So more renewables, also development of hydrogen, not in isolation by each and every member state, but also as cross-border initiatives. All of these areas will count towards the green target, and to monitor the compliance with that target, we will use the normal tool that we have for monitoring spending in the budget, marker, but also beefed up with work that is ongoing in Europe at the moment. All of this is also direct commitment was announced by the President in a State of the Union speech, explaining that we will try to have 30% of the spending of the borrowing used for Next Generation EU in the form of green bonds. And then finally, and that's my last point, all of the spending in the facilities, not only 37%, everything will have to comply with the do no significant harm principle, ensuring that everything is consistent really with the green agenda. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Céline. And this makes clear that this recovery fund aims also at putting the European Union at the forefront of the fight against climate change, and there are other elements that have to do with the trade policy that will also contribute to this. So let's hope that the EU can play a really crucial role in terms of leadership for this global challenge we have. I would like now to go back to Claudia and basically to ask her to ask you about the issue of how we're going to be able to deal with the large amount of debt that all member states are going to be accumulating. Of course, Next Generation EU is going to mean that there's going to be more debt at the European level and a little bit less debt at the domestic level. But there's an ongoing discussion here about the levels of debt to GDP are going to be high, and maybe we were going to be needing a period of very low interest rates for even longer than we expected. The Federal Reserve in the US has already said that it's willing to accept a little bit higher inflation to be able to reduce the real value of debt in the coming years. The ECB is reviewing its monetary policy strategy as well. So where is Germany in this debate? What is your current thinking about how we're going to be able to deal with the debt burden going forward?
Yes, thank you, Federico. Yes, indeed. I mean, already in March, the Commission and we all practically have put into effect the general escape clause of the Stability and Growth Pact, and this has been activated for the first time in our lifetime. And we think that with this, we have the necessary flexibility to take all the measures necessary to cope with the crisis. It is a possibility of a temporary deviation, and while it is rather difficult, of course, to envisage how things will go on. Marcel has been describing the risks in Europe and elsewhere, and it is very difficult, of course, to see where we go from here. You have, Federico, you have mentioned the ECB now examining their politics. I have to admit that there is a general rule for the German government that we are not commenting on what the ECB is doing. So I will stick to that, and I beg your pardon on that. But if I have another minute or so to go, I would love to comment on two things Marcel and Céline have mentioned before, because Marcel said he's a little bit afraid that maybe in member countries the effect of the RRF will be different, and Céline pointed out which flagships the European Commission has been putting forward. I would like to add a new angle on that, saying that at least for the German Council presidency, but even before, when we were just Germany as a member country, it has been very important that we do something all together in Europe. And we have put forward already before the crisis some ideas on how to strengthen our strategic autonomy. Let me just name all those IPCEIs, important project of common European interest, for example, on microelectronics, which was the first one, then the battery cell production, the second one, and now, as Céline has mentioned, hydrogen. Indeed, I mean, we are thinking about putting forward a hydrogen IPCEI. And to add another aspect on data, the idea of having a European cloud where European SMEs could put their data into without risking that it would be spread around the whole globe is also an idea which Germany has put on the table, which has been supported by the President of the European Commission. And I just will let the keyword Gaia X drop, because this is something where we think we could work all together. And if you just look at the member countries who, for example, have flagged their interest in the IPCI on battery cell production, I mean, there are a lot, and it's not just something which has been done by 2 or 3 member countries. So I think this is something we should keep in mind also for becoming more strategically autonomous in the next year, and where we should prepare the ground right now. And it's also some kind of a flagship where we can say, hey, we are Europeans, we're all sticking together, we're working together, and this is something which could add on overcoming the crisis as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and don't worry at all. I'll redirect the monetary policy question to Marcel in a minute, and I would like to emphasize that what you just said about strategic autonomy is crucial. We are going towards a very complicated geopolitical landscape, and we need, economic sovereignty, technological sovereignty and autonomy. And actually, NextGenerationEU opens the door for, somehow a new thinking around the international role of the euro, which is also part of this strategic autonomy. But let me go back to Carlos and the Spanish debate a little bit more. In the case of Spain, there's some discussion currently about the capacity to absorb so many funds in such a short period of time. And also a discussion around, the different elements that you just explained that are on the table. Spain has already applied for the SURE funding. We have NextGenerationEU, but we're talking about the transfer part, not yet the loans part. So if you could, tell us a little bit what is the current thinking about, absorption capacity, and also what instruments are we going to use.
Sure, Federico. Just before getting into this question, I want to highlight what my predecessor just said, which is the importance to bring this regional and even sub-regional angle to the whole facility. So we shouldn't be just looking at what each country can do on its own with its own plan and its own specific economy. We think that the plan can have also synergies and even a multiplier effect if we try to undertake some regional projects along the lines that have been mentioned, the cloud and batteries and so on, and not only pan-European but also sub-regional projects would make a lot of sense, and we should be working in this sense. Then on the absorption capacity, it is clearly a big challenge, and we know that. So we are considering that we expect basically to receive next year somewhere around 25 billion euros. And we are already considering that we're going to have this in our own budget, and we will be spending them according to the principles of the plans approved by the Commission, hopefully beginning of this year. The absorption capacity has challenges on both fronts, on the domestic and on the European level. On the European level, it's very important that we put in place a system which is effective and where the decision-making process is smooth, where, for instance, it's not only the time we spend in the approval of the plans, but also subsequent discussions on disbursements. They should be done smoothly with the necessary controls, of course, but quickly to ensure delivery 2021, 2022, and 2023. But it is very important that we get a significant part of the funds already next year, because we're going to need them to put our economies back on track. And here we are working with the Commission, with the institutions, and we rely on the capacity of our German friends as a presidency to reach a good agreement with the Parliament in the trilogues and the Commission. But we're also working here at home. We are working on some legal amendments to the whole framework for procurement. So we are working on a royal decree law that will make sure that we avoid some bottlenecks in the procedure for approving the plans and the projects, and then interacting with the Commission with all the certification process that's going to be necessary. And I have to say that we are leveraging already on some work that had been done in previous months and even last year, which is the identification of specific projects projects and plans that meet the requirements of the plans and the top priorities that I mentioned before.
Thank you very much. And now let me go back to Marcel on this question of debt and monetary policy. I know you've been working on these topics for a while, and these are very much connected to what we said before about the macroeconomic scenario. But I would like to ask you about your current thinking on this issue of are we going towards a world with more inflation because of all the stimulus, with less inflation or even deflation because of the recessionary elements and the lack of confidence that can undermine consumption and investment? And more specifically on the exit strategy for dealing with these huge amounts of debt and with these internal discussions, not at the ECB, but in general in Europe about the future of monetary policy. I would like you to reflect on that.
Thank you. Yeah, let me start with monetary policy and the ECB. Now, the ECB has acted very decisively with the PEP program, with the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, has provided a lot of liquidity. And if you look at spreads in financial markets, you see that this has been largely successful. Now, the main challenge I see is one of deflation and not inflation over the next 2-3 years. This crisis in economic terms is more a demand-driven crisis than a supply-driven crisis. And I think this is now becoming quite clear. In the first phase of the crisis, we were worried about supply chains being interrupted, so mainly the crisis being on the supply side. But we realize the key problem we have in Europe at the moment and globally as well is that corporate investment is very low, and also consumption, private consumption has been going down. So the challenge for the ECB will be more one of deflation than of inflation. We see this already in the numbers, that inflation numbers have been going down, partly in deflationary territory. So this will be the key challenge. Now, it's very important to emphasize that the European Central Bank alone cannot tackle this crisis, cannot make sure that it meets its inflation, its price stability objective. This is only possible if fiscal policy supports monetary policy. And again, over the last 6 months, I think fiscal policy has been doing a very good job. It needs to continue doing so over the next year. So fiscal policy at the national level needs to support the recovery and avoid a worse outcome in terms of the risks that we described. Now, the issue of debt is one that clearly is of big concern. We have seen a sharp increase in private and public debt. The rise in corporate debt is quite clear. Many companies are over indebted. I mentioned early on the risk of corporate insolvencies, but also public debt has increased sharply. In countries like Italy, to probably more than 155% of debt, public debt to GDP, but in every other country as well. Now, I think I am, from an economic perspective, not so concerned about this because we see that financing conditions remain very favorable and governments have been doing a very good job in terms of fiscal policy. So there's a high degree of confidence and trust in the fiscal policy and the debt path of also of Italy. And this is reflected in the relatively low levels of interest rates and the relatively low spreads. I think this is very important to emphasize. So my concern over the next 5 to 6 years is not about the magnitude of public debt. My main concern is the question, how do we generate enough growth in the European Union that will allow governments to reduce public debt over the long term? That is the single most important instrument, also historically, to reduce both public debt and private debt. And the alternative, high inflation, so in a way to inflate away public and private debt, I think is not a very good strategy. It's a better strategy than cutting public investment for sure. I think we must have learned from the European crisis 10 years ago that many governments cut too much on public investment, thereby reduced productivity, hindered a stronger economic recovery. So for me, one important lesson of the global financial crisis and the subsequent European crisis is that governments need to be expansionary in fiscal policy, but very importantly to do that in investment that supports productivity and economic growth. This is the most effective and the best path to both generate jobs, employment, growth, and at the same time reducing public debt in the long run.
Thank you very much. So I absolutely agree that the key element is to increase growth potential, and the best way to pay back the debt is through an increase in the denominator of this debt to GDP ratio, and therefore let's hope that the funds are going to be useful for increasing productivity. I start with my last round of questions and go to Celine again. Basically, I would like to ask you about the way you're dealing with this whole program at the European Commission. I know if you have reconfigured somehow the internal mechanisms, that you have different groups of people and teams following the different countries. So are you going to look at the recovery programs all together? Are you going to have a discussion, a comparison? How are you structuring all these elements internally? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I think the recovery and resilience gives us opportunity to transform the economy, and it's going much beyond the traditional European semester, which is a framework for the facility, and which traditionally focused more on macroeconomic and social policy only. So here we really have the entire European agenda, the tool to implement it both in terms of reforms and in terms of investment. So to try and have effective structure for the implementation of that facility, the Commission has set up a dedicated task force, which indeed I'm heading, and that task force is organized in a matrix. So both with country teams that are responsible for engaging and stay in the development of their plans and thereafter in the implementation of their plans, and also by thematic component for the different elements of the plans, like the green elements or the social component of the plan or the digital aspects to be covered. And that matrix organization should allow us to also ensure perfect consistency across the plans of the member states. Obviously, the plans will be different because every member state has specific challenges and also country-specific recommendations that have to be addressed. But it is really important that the same type of issue and the same type of challenges are addressed in a consistent manner. The organization of the task force is also quite important, together with the colleagues of the economic department of the Commission, to all the policy DGs, so the sectoral departments in charge of climate, in charge of social or even digital or culture, are linked into this work and can contribute their specific expertise to support the member states and to review the plans. This is also important, and I'll stop there, to ensure the consistency of the funding, because as you know, the funding of the plans come in addition to the cohesion funding, but also to the instrument for the digital program or for the transport program. So we have to ensure that all of these different fundings are used in the most effective and more complementary way by the member states, and this coordination function that we also have in that respect should be helpful. So we are in intensive phase of discussion with the member states, and I hope that it will allow us to support them effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Celine. And going specifically again to Claudia and to the thinking in Germany about the proposals and the recovery program and the structural reforms you are going to put on the table. You already mentioned some elements that are crucial, but I would like to ask you to give us a little more detail on what are the reforms that you think Germany needs to face the economy of the 21st century.
Yes, thank you, Federico. First of all, I must say I think Spain is ahead of Germany in presenting the plan, because we're still working on it. but one thing has already been clear right from the beginning for Germany, namely to practically echo our national decisions on the stimulus package with the RRF project, which means that with our national stimulus package, we already have foreseen to promote specifically climate neutral politics. Celine has mentioned e-mobility. Indeed, this is one of the sectors we have been including in our national stimulus package, and the same goes for digital transformation. So we have decided in general terms that most of what will be the amount for Germany on the Recovery and Resilience Facility will be dedicated to the stimulus package content. There are some exceptions, but this is the general rule. And here we are working on that, and I hope we will be ready soon.
Thank you very much. And now going back to Carlos, again, around this discussion about the debt to GDP ratios and the sustainability, how do you envisage, the way we can stabilize, in the case of Spain, the debt to GDP ratio? Are you concerned about this? What are your current thinking?
Yeah. Again, Federico, let me take advantage of what Claudia and Celine just mentioned to make a brief remark about where we are with our own plan here in Spain, and then move to the debt to GDP ratio. And not that I want to avoid it. It is indeed, it's clear that we have presented the España Puede plan, which sets the priorities of the plan. But what we're working now on is the very detailed plan that has to be submitted to the Commission according to the guidelines that were released a few weeks ago. This is a major task because we have to go very much into the details of each and every project with the flagships, with benchmarks, with reforms and investments. So it's very detailed. We've made a lot of progress, as I said before, and we're planning to submit the first broad draft already this week or early next week to the Commission. We've been exchanging views with Celine and her team in recent weeks. But we will keep on submitting subsequent patches of documents as we have them ready, as the Commission have asked not to wait until the very last minute and to have a continuous interactive dialogue. So we are already engaged in this process, which is very ambitious and challenging for both sides, from our side and definitely at the Commission level. Debt to GDP ratio, it's clear that we are also going to see a sharp increase here in Spain this year, which is sad. I've been in the Treasury for several years already, and one of our biggest efforts in recent years have been to bring the debt to GDP ratio down. We peaked slightly above 100% of GDP in the peak of the crisis. It has been going down. It was close to 95% last year, and now we're going to bring it up again this year. So somewhere around 118% along these lines. That's what we expect for this year. And again, subject to the uncertainty around the economic situation, we expect it to peak at this level and even next year go down a little bit marginally because the nominal growth will compensate still a high deficit. And definitely we expect to see it going on a downward trend more clearly starting in 2022. So we think that the conditions are good for funding the treasuries around Europe. I share the views previously exposed. We don't see it as a big threat at this stage. But we have to look at it carefully with a medium and long-term perspective. And also we have to look at other risks around the economy, not only in terms of public debt, but also situation in the corporate sector, which is, as has been mentioned before, a very difficult one, and that will need a very careful analysis and strategy from our side as well.
Thank you. And on that point you made before, it's clearly a very important element to make sure that the plans are fast and the negotiations with the Commission are relatively smooth, so the disbursement of the money and the funds can come precisely at the moment when we need them most, and not when we are getting out of the bad situation. So going to Marcel finally on my last question before we have this commitment to finish in an hour before 12 o'clock. I want to ask you, another more technical macroeconomic question about productivity, the multiplier effects of this plan, and where is your view here? In the last years, there's been this kind of puzzle amongst economists. We have a lot of investments and revolutions in technology, but we don't see productivity increase. You mentioned before that investment is key for productivity increases. So do you think that these funds could have a large multiplier, bring in private sector money, and more importantly, do you think that we're going to be able to increase productivity substantially due to these plans? Thank you.
Two general points two answers to your question, Federico. One is, I think what's really important, we cannot emphasize enough, is how important convergence is within the European Union. The EU as a single market, the euro as a common currency can function only if there is a convergence process. So the Next Generation EU is clearly designed also to contribute to that. Second point, and I think I, of course, echo what everyone else has been saying, the Next Generation EU funding is very crucial to improve productivity. It's really about enabling, supporting structural change. The very strong focus on climate protection, environment, with a very important focus on the digitalization, on structural transformation of our EU economy. So I think I would describe Next Generation EU as a necessary but not sufficient element. And I don't want to repeat all the positive points that have been said. I just want to emphasize that national policymakers also need to do their part now to use the funding in a wise way, so that it doesn't substitute existing domestic funds, but really complements them, so that it's really a truly additional component. Second, it needs to be complemented at the national level as well as at the European level with other structural reforms, making institutions more efficient, improving regulation. That also means completing the single market for services. It means having a capital market union, so also on that side. So there are many other elements we need to consider in conjunction with the Next Generation EU component. So again, it's necessary but not sufficient. If not other steps at the European level in terms of regulation, in terms of completing the single market, and also national policy reforms are implemented in conjunction, we must realize that the Next Generation EU will not be effective, not as effective as it could. So this is important for me to emphasize, and that gets to your question, Federico, about multipliers. So I see this as a huge opportunity also to understand the pandemic as a wake-up call to speed up that structural transformation. We must realize that in many important areas, economic areas, such as digitalization, information communication technologies, Europe is lagging behind the US and parts of Asia, China, Korea, Japan. So we really need to speed up that process. So I want to be optimistic. I think everyone has understood how important that transformation process is. But for me, in a nutshell, really the key point is we need to take Next Generation EU as a first impetus, but it needs to be followed by other reforms, other additional steps, both at the European and the national level.
Thank you very much, Marcel. And you've all been very disciplined. We are right on track for my final remarks. I'm going to ask you if anybody wants to react or has something that didn't say. Or I had the Brexit risk on my notes as well. We didn't touch on that, but the good news is that in a way, we still have like a month to get to a deal. That's complicated. But on the other hand, Brexit is not the key element of our discussions, and we are, I think, are very clear about that. So any final reactions, or if not, I will wrap up with some of the conclusions.
No, from my side.
Celine? No? Claudia? Okay, so basically I will not attempt to summarize all you have said, but I think there are 2 or 3 important takeaways from this discussion. The first one, I think, is that Europe is clearly part of the solution. And I think it has to be re-emphasized, because I remember in March, at the beginning of the pandemic, before the Eurogroup agreement that Carlos mentioned, there was a discussion, Europe is not reacting fast. Now it's very clear that both in the side of the monetary policy, the fiscal reaction, and also the institutional step forwards that are embedded in NextGenerationEU, Europe is part of the solution, and all member states understand the usefulness of Europe in a moment when there was some skepticism in some countries around the European integration process. Second, I would say that we have a huge task ahead of us. I think the Commission is very well prepared, and thank you, Celine, for giving us also the details of the restructuring, the process, the details. There's a lot of confusion I see on the Spanish debate. I guess it's the same in other countries as to exactly when the funds are coming, what is the process. I think it's useful to explain to citizens how it works and what can we expect, and also to emphasize that this is about structural transformation of the economies and prepare them for the 21st century challenges, digital, green, inclusion, etc. Right? And the last element I would like to point out, which came about, and I think it was important, is that there's a risk that has to do with corporate debt. We already have identified part of the risk that are identifiable, like the issue of Brexit or the trade war or even the extension of the pandemic. But it's important to keep in mind that it's crucial to make sure that the financial sector, the banking system that was part of the problem, if you want, in the 2008-9 crisis, and now is part of the solution, keeps us being part of the solution. And for that, we have to be alert and aware of the problems of the sector. And finally, a last point, which is that debt to GDP's ratios are going to go up, but I think we are in a moment in which, this is manageable, and there are a number of issues. We're going to be needing to think about the trajectory of debt down the road, but at this point, we have to focus on doing whatever is necessary to make sure that growth potential is increased and that there are no scars on the long run in terms of unemployment or insolvencies of small and medium enterprises that can hinder future economic growth. So on that note, I would like to remind you that we're going to have another event organized by Bertelsmann. That's going to be on November 6th on Social Europe at 1:30. So I invite you all to join as well. And thank you very much to the German presidency, to the Bertelsmann Foundation, to the European Commission, and to the 4 speakers. I think this was really very useful. Lots of questions around the table that were answered, some uncertainties that remain. But I hope that this was useful for our audience, and I would like to thank you very much. See you next time.